Καλησπέρα σας για μία ακόμη φορά και καλωσορίσετε στην πρώτη διάλεξη του χρόνου αυτού, του 2015, που είναι ο 12ος χρόνος διαλέξεων του Ελεύθερου Πανεπιστημίου για την Ομογένεια του Λονδίνου, που οργανώνεται από την Ελληνική Κυπριακή Αδελφότητα σε συνεργασία με το Πανεπιστήμιο στην. Η απόψινή διάλεξη θα μιλήσουμε στα αγγλικά σήμερα, αγαπητοί συμφοιτητές, να αλλάξουμε λίγο το μοτίβο. From Barbarity to Barbaros, δηλαδή άλλο Barbarity. The first 12 months of the First World War and their enduring relevance in the Eastern Mediterranean today. Εισηγητής, ο γνωστός σε όλους μας, διότι έχει ήδη δώσει σειρά διαλέξεων εδώ στην αδελφότητα, ο Dr. Κλέαρχος Κυριακίδης, Senior Lecturer στο School of Law, University of Hertfordshire, the Havilland Campus, κλπ. Τον οποίο ευχαριστούμε για ακόμη μια φορά που δέχτηκε την πρόσκληση να μας μιλήσει για αυτόν το πολύ ενδιαφέρον θέμα, το οποίο έχω μια περίληψη η οποία υποτίθεται ότι θα ήταν μικρή, αλλά βλέπω είναι αρκετά μεγάλη. Δεν θα την πω, διότι αν την πω θα είμαι εγώ ο εισηγητής. Θα πω όμως ότι είναι διάλεξης που συνδυάζει το τι είχε γίνει στον Πρώτο Παγκόσμιο Πόλεμο, ορισμένα γεγονότα, παραδείγματος χάρη invasion of Belgium by one of the guarantor powers, η Γερμανία. Η δεύτερη ήταν η απόφαση της Τουρκίας, Οθωμανικής τότε, to ally with Germany and to deploy its naval forces in the Black Sea in order to bombard Russia. Third, it was the beginning of the genocide of Armenians and Greeks living in the then Ottoman territories. And today we have the examples that the German invasion of Belgium in 1914 serves as a warning that small sovereign states, including the Republic of Cyprus, are vulnerable, particularly if they are situated close to a neighbor which is much larger, as well as better armed, ambitious, expansionist, and driven by an aggressive ideology. The German invasion of Belgium in 1914, in common with the Turkish invasion of Cyprus 60 years later, likewise serves as a reminder that guarantor powers are capable of attacking the countries that they are legally obliged to guarantee. The alliance with Germany in 1914 illustrates that the Turks are not averse to betraying their British or other supposed allies in the perceived interests of Turkey or Islam. This lesson of history may help us to understand the stance adopted by Turkey in relation to the so-called Islamic State of Iraq and other Islamic movements. The barbaric genocide of the Armenians, in common with the genocide of the Assyrians and the Greeks living in the Ottoman territories, reminds us that the Middle East, the greater Middle East, is an exceptionally dangerous place. and I am sure that Klearchos will expand on this and many other points that are included in the summary that I will not read you. We all know Dr. Klearchos Kyriacidis. He's a senior lecturer and a non-practicing solicitor in the School of Law at the University of Hertfordshire, where he teaches ethics, constitutional law, and property law. He's also an executive committee member of the West London Law Society and the Society for Modern Greek Studies. He was educated in many universities, including Cambridge. He benefited from a cross-disciplinary education encompassing law, international relations, and history, a background which has influenced his teaching, research, and writing over the years. He has also written about the office of Attorney General in the government in the UK and the history of two intertwined genres of Greek music, Rembetika and Laika. He gave a lecture here about Rembetika a year ago. His latest publication is a research paper published in November 14. It is entitled Scotland and the Slippery Slope from Devolution to the Independence Referendum and Beyond. Some lessons to be learned and their relevance to Cyprus and its fellow member states in the European Union. I think before Dr. Kyriacidis gives us his lecture, I will call upon the President of the Overseas Cypriot, Mr. Barbaros, to say a few words about Klearchos, and after Mr. Barbaros finishes, ο Γενικός Πρόξενος θα μας πει και αυτό στα δικά του.
Καλησπέρα και από εμένα, εκ μέρους της Παγκόσμιας Ομοσπονδίας του Δήμου. Ήθελα καταρχήν να συγχαρώ την Ουκραϊκή αδερφότητα για το πολυδιάστατο έργο το οποίο βγάζει έξω στην παροικία εδώ και τόσα χρόνια, από το 1934. Είναι πραγματικά ένα υπόδειγμα οργάνωσης και επειδή ένας από τους στόχους για αυτή τη χρονιά που μπαίνει, που θα απασχολήσει όλους την οργανωμένη παροικία, ορισμένοι που ασχολούνται να γνωρίζουν πολύ καλά, είναι πώς θα πετύχουμε αυτή η παροικία να οργανωθεί με τέτοιον τρόπο ώστε να αποδίδει στο έργο το οποίο θέλουμε να κάνουμε σε αυτή την χώρα. Και ένας τρόπος να το κάνουμε αυτό είναι πρώτα-πρώτα να οργανωθούμε σαν οργανώσεις πρότυπα σαν αυτό της Κυπριακής Αδερφότητας, αλλά και να εμπλακεί και η νεολαία. Εδώ έχουμε τεράστια ελλείμματα, να τους δώσουμε την ευκαιρία, ώστε να δοθεί μια νέα όθηση στη δουλειά την οποία πρέπει να κάνουμε εδώ για το καλό της Κύπρου. Είναι και μια ιστορική μέρα σήμερα. Είναι 15 Ιανουαρίου, που είναι λίγο πιο μεγάλη από μένα. Θα θυμούνται το 1950, σήμερα, είχε γίνει το ενωτικό δημοψήφισμα. Και σχεδόν ολόκληρο του Κυπριακός Ελληνικός ψήφισαν τότε την ένωση της Κύπρου με την Ελλάδα. Φυσικά ένας μεγάλος πόθος, ο οποίος, όπως είχε δεχτεί πολύ εύστοχα, προδόθηκε και από εχθρούς και από φίλους. Και τους καταδείξαμε σήμερα. Και αναφερόμενος φυσικά στην νεολαία, με την εμπλοκή της νεολαίας, θα πρέπει να πλέξω το εγκόμιο του Κλέαρχου Κυριακίδη, ο οποίος πραγματικά είναι ένα παιδί το οποίο μας έχει εντυπωσιάσει στην παρουσία του, όχι μόνο σαν ακαδημαϊκός, το χώρο που δεν ασχολείται, που είναι τα γύρω λόγω, αλλά και η εμπλοκή του στο εθνικό μας θέμα. Έχει παρουσιάσει τόσες πολλές μεγάλες διαλέξεις και μελέτες πάνω στο Κυπριακό, αλλά τον είχα χαρεί ιδιαίτερα όταν τελευταία κάποια ερμαφρόντινη στο LSC, παρότι λυπούμε δεν τα κατάφερα να είναι εκεί. Αλλά έχω δει χάρη κάποιων ενεργειών ενός κοινού φίλου που είναι εδώ, είχα δει το βίντεο και καλά τους έκανε εκεί. Και είναι καλά να βλέπουν τέτοιοι άνθρωποι με κύρος να δίνουν απαντήσεις και να βάζουν το θέμα της Κύπρου στη σωστή του βάση. Επομένως, θέλω να σας συγχαρώ. Γνωρίζω και την οικογένεια σου παλιά, διότι ήταν κατάγονται από την Τροχίνα, όπου ο παππούς μου είχε υπηρετούσε ως παπάς τότε στην περιοχή της Λεύκας και πραγματικά χαίρομαι να βλέπω το έργο το οποίο κάνεις και είναι τιμή αυτή την παροικία που έχει παιδιά όπως τον Κλέαρχο, πάρα πολλά, αλλά πρέπει να συντονιστούν για να αποδίδει αυτό το έργο που κάνουμε εδώ. Και αυτός θα είναι ο στόχος μας το 2010. Σας ευχαριστώ πολύ.
Κύριε Πρόεδρε της Παγκόσμιας Ομοσπονδίας Απολύμων Κυπρίου, κύριε Αντιπρόεδρε της Περιοχής Κυπριακής Αδερφότητας, φίλοι εκπρόσωποι σωματείων και οργανώσεων της Παραλίας, επιτρέψτε μου για άλλη μια φορά να μεταφέρω τα συγχαρητήρια της Κυπριακής Πάτης Αρκουστίας για αυτήν την πολύ ωραία πρωτοβουλία που αναλαμβάνεται εδώ και 12 χρόνια στο θεσμό του Ελληνικού Πανεπιστημίου. Πιστεύουμε ότι ο θεσμός αυτός καταξιώνει και την ίδια την Κυπριακή Αδερφότητα, αλλά και την παροικία σαν έναν οργανισμό ο οποίος διατηρεί στην πράξη σχέσεις και επαφές με την Κύπρο, έχει στο επίκεντρο της θέματα τα οποία αφορούν την Κύπρο αυτήν καθ' αυτή και βεβαίως την παροικία ως έναν άμεσα ενδιαφερόμενο μέρος για τις εξελίξεις στην Κύπρο. Η σημερινή διάλεξη από τον Δόκτωρα Κυριακίδη, τον οποίο επίσης οφείλω να συγχαρώ γιατί είναι δυστυχώς από τους πολύ λίγους ακαδημαϊκούς οι οποίοι έχουν διατηρήσει στενή επαφή με την οργανωμένη παροικία και γι' αυτόν τον συγχαίρω. Είναι ένας άνθρωπος ο οποίος πολλές φορές στο παρελθόν και φαντάζομαι και απόψε δεν θα διστάζει να βγει εύκαμπτος στις απόψεις του για τρέχοντα θέματα και για ιστορικά θέματα. Ανεξαρτήτως αν σε ορισμένες περιπτώσεις μπορεί να υπάρχουν διαφωνίες σε επιμέρους σημεία, στο τέλος της ημέρας, εκείνο το οποίο έχει σημασία είναι ότι μας μεταδίδεται μια ακαδημαϊκή γνώση, μια ίσως άλλη φυσική γωνία σε θέματα που απασχολούν και απασχολούν έντονα την Κύπρο και ιδιαίτερα τον κυπριακών ελληνισμό. Το απόψινό θέμα είναι, πιστεύω, πολύ επίκαιρο, κέριο, γιατί όντως η ιστορία μπορεί να μην επαναλαμβάνεται επακριβώς, αλλά οι ομοιότητες του παρόντος με το παρελθόν δεν πρέπει ουδέποτε να ξεχνούν. Υπάρχουν και ομοιότητες με τους πρώτους μήνες του Πρώτου Παγκοσμίου, με το 2014, τους πρώτους μήνες του Πρώτου Παγκοσμίου πολέμου, αλλά υπάρχουν και διαφορές. Τότε μιλούσαμε για μια Οθωμανική Τουρκία η οποία κατέρρε, ήταν ο άρρωστος, ήταν ο ασθενής, ο μεγάλος ασθενής της Ευρώπης. Τώρα έχουμε μια Τουρκία η οποία δεν είναι μεν Οθωμανική, αλλά η εντύπωση που δίδεται είναι ότι έχει Οθωμανικές λέξεις. Ο Barbaros ήταν Τούρκος ναύαρχος στα 1500, ο οποίος ταύτισε το όνομα του με την Οθωμανική κυριαρχία στην Μεσόγειο, όχι μόνο στην Ανατολική, αλλά σε ολόκληρη τη Μεσόγειο. Δεν είναι τυχαίο που το πλοίο αυτό το οποίο εισβάλλει ουσιαστικά στην αποκλειστική οικονομική ζωή της Κύπρου φέρει αυτόν τον όνομα. Υπάρχει και συμβολισμός, αλλά υπάρχει και πρακτική σημασία σε αυτόν το οποίο συμβαίνει. Η Τουρκία βρίσκεται σε μια κατάσταση η οποία της επιτρέπει να διεκδικεί πέραν και έξω από αυτό που αποκαλείται διεθνές δίκαιο. Και για όσους ενδιαφέρονται περισσότερο, ο Barbaros, αυτός ο Τούρκος ναύαρχος, γεννήθηκε στην Μητυλίνη, η μητέρα του ονομαζόταν Κατερίνα, ήταν σύζυγος ιερέα, ο δε πατέρας του λέει ότι ήταν και αυτός επίσης Έλληνας, ο οποίος εξισλαμίστηκε, και μάλιστα ο Χαϊρεντίν Ασάς είχε και έναν αδερφό ο οποίος ονομαζόταν Ηλίας. Επομένως, αυτά για την ιστορία και για τους όποιους συμβολισμούς υπάρχουν με το σήμερα. Η Τουρκία κατέχει τη μισή Κύπρο, εισβάλλει σήμερα στις νότιες θάλασσες και δυστυχώς, εν αντιθέσει με το τι έκανε η Μεγάλη Βρετανία το 1914, πως η Κύπρια δύναμη δεν το έπραξε το 1974 και δεν το πράξει ούτε και σήμερα με την κατάσταση την οποία επικρατεί στην Ανατολική Μεσόγειο. Θέλω να τονίσω ακόμα κάτι. Σήμερα μπορεί να έχετε δει κάποια δημοσιεύματα τα οποία ουσιαστικά επιβεβαίωσαν και ο Διευθυντής της Κεντρικής Υπηρεσίας Πληροφορικών. Για κάποιους είναι αστείο, αλλά είναι όντως πολύ σοβαρό. Κυπριακά διπλοκάμπινα χρησιμοποιούνται από τζιχαντιστές σε αυτή την επιχείρηση που έχουν αναλάβει να δημιουργήσουν χαλιφάτα. Αυτά τα διπλοκάμπινα λοιπόν, σύμφωνα με τη δημοσιεύματα, τα οποία λένε ότι τα επιβεβαιώνει ο Διευθυντής της Κεντρικής Υπηρεσίας Πληροφοριών, έφυγαν από τις ελεύθερες περιοχές μέσω κατεχομένων, κατέληξαν στην Τουρκία και από την Τουρκία στη Συρία. Με την ίδια ευκολία, με παρόμοιες φύσεις ευκολία, μπορούν να μεταφερθούν μέσω της κατεχόμενης Κύπρου και μαχητές από την Ευρώπη, ίσως προπλισμός από την Ευρώπη, ίσως και κριτικά από την Ευρώπη, ίσως και τεχνογνωσία από την Ευρώπη. Γι' αυτό είναι πολύ σημαντικό και σε αυτήν την χώρα, αλλά και στην Ευρωπαϊκή Ένωση, να γίνει αντιληπτό ότι η Κύπρος, ενώ μπορεί να είναι ένας προβλεπτός, καλός και πιστός σύμμαχος των δυτικών χωρών, ταυτόχρονα, ένεκα της συνεχιζόμενης κατοχής, μπορεί να αποτελέσει έναν παράγοντα ο οποίος δεν είναι υποβοηθητικός στις προσπάθειες της Δύσης να κατηγοράξουν αυτό το φαινόμενο που ονομάζεται ISIS. Και ένα άλλο δίδαγμα, το οποίο από ό,τι είδα λίγο στην περίληψη τώρα που μου έχει δώσει ο Νίνος, που θα κάνει στη διάλεξη που θα κάνει ο αγαπητός Κλέαρχος, είναι ότι η Τουρκία όπως δεν υπήρξε πιστός σύμμαχος παλαιότερα, έτσι και τώρα στην πράξη φαίνεται να αποδεικνύεται ότι δεν είναι πιστός σύμμαχος της Δύσης. Υπάρχει το στοιχείο σε αυτή την ιστορία την οποία σας εγώ μεταφέρει ότι η Τουρκία όντως γίνεται διαμετακομιστικός σταθμός υποβοήθησης του ISIS με τα ιστορία των οχημάτων, αλλά και γνωστό ότι έχει βοηθήσει και στην διέλευση μαχητών προς τη Συρία, υποτίθεται για να καταρρεύσει το καθεστώς Άσαντ, αλλά και εκ των υστέρων, όταν πλέον είχε διαφανεί ότι το ISIS έχει τους δικούς του σχεδιασμούς, συνέχισε αυτή την προσπάθεια να τη στηρίζει είτε μη υποβοηθώντας τις ειδικές χώρες στην προσπάθεια τους και στις επιδρομές τους εναντίον της ISIS, είτε ουσιαστικά κάνοντας την πάπια ή γυρνώντας την πλάτη σε διελεύσεις μαχητών και οπλισμού από το έδαφος της προς τη Συρία και το Ιράκ. Συνεπώς, υπάρχουν ομοιότητες, ενώ τότε είχαμε να κάνουμε με μια Τουρκία, αλλά υπάρχουν και διαφορές. Ενώ τότε είχαμε να κάνουμε με μια Τουρκία Οθωμανική που πετρέται, τώρα έχουμε να κάνουμε με μια Τουρκία η οποία προσπαθεί να επιβάλλει την παρουσία της, γίνεται πιο υπεριαλιστική, γίνεται πιο επεκτατική, και αυτό είναι ένα ζήτημα το οποίο δεν αφορά μόνο την Κύπρο, αφορά ολόκληρη την Ανατολική Μεσόγειο και πιστεύω ακόμα και ολόκληρη την Ευρώπη. Γιατί η Οθωμανική Αυτοκρατορία, την οποία ο κ. Νταβούτογλου στο βιβλίο του θέλει να επαναφέρει στρατηγικό βάθος, έχει το ένα της πόλης στον Κάφκαζο και το άλλο της πόλης στα Βαλκάνια. Και από ό,τι φαίνεται, αυτούς τους συνδυασμούς η Τουρκία, χωρίς να τους ομολογεί επισήμως, στην πράξη σιγά σιγά σταδιακά και σε βάθος χρόνου θέλει να τους εφαρμόσει. Και αυτό αποτελεί κίνδυνο όχι μόνο για την Κύπρο, αλλά όπως έχω πει και για ολόκληρη την Ευρώπη. Παλαιότερα η Οθωμανική Αυτοκρατορία έχει καταλήξει μέχρι τις πύλες της Βιέννης, στις κεντρικές αυτοκρατορίες της Ευρωπαϊκής. Δεν πιστεύω ότι θα υπάρξει επανάληψη τέτοιου φαινομένου. Από τότε μέχρι σήμερα έχουν γίνει πολλά. Στη θέση της Οθωμανικής Αυτοκρατορίας υπάρχουν τώρα 42 κράτη, τα οποία σίγουρα δεν θα διαλυθούν μια νυχτή προκειμένου να απλωθεί το όποιον τουρκικό όραμα. Ωστόσο, ο κίνδυνος του τουρκικού επεκτατισμού υπάρχει και αυτός αγγίζει ιδιαίτερα εμάς, σαν Κύπρο και την Ελλάδα, η οποία εξάλλου υποφέρει από τις τουρκικές διεκδικήσεις στο Αιγαίο εδώ και πολλά χρόνια. Κλείνω ευχαριστώντας την άλλη την αδερφότητα για την πρόσκληση, για τον Δόκτωρα Κυριακίδη, για το πολύ ωραίο θέμα που έχει επιλέξει να μας παρουσιάσει απόψε και εσάς για την παρουσία σας εδώ, που με αυτόν τον τρόπο στηρίζετε με έμπρακτον τρόπο αυτή την προσπαθία της ελληνικής κυπριακής αδερφότητας. Ευχαριστώ.
Ευχαριστώ πολύ τον Γενικό Πρόξενο και τον Πρόεδρο της ΚΟΜΑ. Πρωτού δώσω το λόγο στον Δόκτωρα Κυριακίδη, απλά να ευχαριστήσω τους χορηγούς επικοινωνίας της εφημερίδας Ελευθερία, τα Κυριακή, Ελεύθερο, τον ελληνικό ραδιοσταθμό Λονδίνου, το Hellenic TV, το ΡΙΚ και το ΚΙΠΕ. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Klearchos Kyriacides.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Can you hear me? Yes. Apologies for speaking in English, but I'm first of all obliged to thank the opening speakers for their very kind remarks, their thoughtful observations, and for reminding us that history is something that we need to study in order to try to understand the present. I'm highly conscious of what occurred in Paris just a few days ago. I can see before me teachers, writers, journalists, editors, people who spend their lives doing what I do, engage in the most precious of freedoms, freedom of expression. The ancient Greek writer Herodotus, the father of history, pointed out that of all of the attributes of democracy, the most important is freedom of speech. We are exercising that right this evening. I will speak for 45 minutes or so, and I will hopefully stimulate a discussion. We may not agree, but we should have a dialogue within the spirit of freedom and democracy and the rule of law. What occurred in Paris last week is totalitarianism, the subjugation of people because of what they say, and there is nothing more abhorrent to a democrat or to those of us who are steeped in the values of democracy and ancient Athens. But of course it was ancient Athens that condemned Socrates to death for what he taught. And that's why we're called academics, because we are the followers of the tradition of Plato, who founded the academy. Now, with those introductory remarks behind me, I need to begin by drawing attention to the foundation of the Greek Cypriot Brotherhood. It was established in 1934 in a spirit of mutual support for the migrants who had arrived in the United Kingdom from what was then known as the Crown Colony of Cyprus. It was established in 1934. My late maternal grandparents arrived in London a bit later on in the 1930s, in 1939, and they regarded the Adelphotida as their second home. So I'm honoured to be here for that reason as well. More to the point, the Greek Cypriot Brotherhood was founded in 1934, which of course was 20 years after the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. Now that year, 1914, will feature prominently in this lecture, which is based on another one that I gave on the 5th of November last year at my university to mark the centenary of the British annexation of Cyprus. Now this year, 1915, will be marked by a number of important centenaries. For example, the British and Allied landings at Gallipoli, the Armenian genocide, and a number of other war-related events. But in this lecture, I would like to highlight just a handful of key developments from the opening few months of the First World War. And I will then move on to articulate some lessons of history which are, I would suggest, of enduring relevance today. Now, I'd like to, if I can make this work, yes, draw your attention to what occurred on the 4th of August 1914. On the 4th of August 1914, the First World War began, or began in earnest, depending on your point of view. I mean, some Greeks would argue that the First World War began in 1911 with the Balkan Wars, but from the British point of view, the First World War began with the German invasion of Belgium on the 4th of August 1914. Now that was part of broader chain of events over the summer of 1914, which had been triggered by the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand of Austria in Sarajevo in June 1914. But more specifically, the German invasion of Belgium was a naked act of aggression and a military move which was unmistakably contrary to a treaty, namely the Treaty of London of 1839. Under that treaty, Germany, in company with the Austro-Hungarians, the French, the Russians and the British, had undertaken to respect and guarantee the neutrality of Belgium. So here we had a guarantor power of Belgium invading Belgium. On the very day of the German invasion of Belgium, the United Kingdom responded to a Belgian appeal for assistance by, I'm quoting here, protesting against this violation of a treaty to which Germany is a party. The British also gave the Germans an ultimatum to respect immediately the neutrality of Belgium. The Germans ignored the British ultimatum, and by the late evening of the 4th of August 1914, the Germans were carrying on with their invasion of Belgium, and this provoked a British declaration of war, ostensibly, interestingly enough, to honour the British guarantee to Belgium. Now, there are salient lessons that we can draw from that episode, which I'll leave to the final part, or the second part of my lecture. But I now want to leave Belgium and move over to the Eastern Mediterranean to find out what happened a few days later. Let's look at what happened in November 1914. Well, shortly before November 1914, the Turks had a stark choice confronting them. After the British declaration of war on Germany in August 1914, Turkey could have either sided with the United Kingdom and thereby acted in harmony with the Anglo-Turkish Convention of Defensive Alliance of 1878, under which the British had undertaken to become the allies of Turkey in return for occupation of the island of Cyprus. That was one option. Turks could have sided with the British. They had a second option. They could have stayed neutral. So this is nothing to do with us. We're away from Europe, we won't get involved. Or the third option was to side with Germany, which had invaded and occupied Belgium in a naked act of aggression contrary to a treaty. Turkey chose to betray the British, to side with Germany, and to attack Russia by means of German-built warships. This came as a painful blow to the British. After all, the United Kingdom had backed Turkey during the Crimean War of 1853 to 1856. The British had allied themselves with Turkey under the treaty I've just mentioned from 1878. And the British had also effectively turned a blind eye to the massacres perpetrated by the Ottoman Turks to the detriment of Armenians, Bulgarians, and others during the late 19th century. And those massacres, by the way, were contrary to the 1878 treaty that Turkey had entered into. So the United Kingdom was left with no practical alternative other than to respond to Turkey's behaviour. So the British formally declared war on Turkey on the 5th of November 1914. But on the same day, the King of England, George V, issued a royal proclamation in which he tried to justify the British declaration of war on Turkey. And he cited a number of matters, one of which was to do with the hostile acts committed by Turkish forces under German officers. I'm quoting from the royal declaration there. The king also, interestingly enough, drew attention to the failure of Turkey to ratify an international treaty. This was the Hague Convention relating to the status of enemy merchant vessels, at the outbreak of hostilities. This was a convention dating back to 1907. Now, I'll come back to this later because Turkey has not ratified the United Nations Law of the Sea Convention, which is to do with the exclusive economic zone of Cyprus. So they have a track record of not ratifying treaties to do with the sea or other related matters. I'll come back to that point later. For the point of view of Cyprus, why this is all important is that on the 5th of November 1914, the British not only declared war on Turkey, but they annexed what was then the Ottoman-owned but British-administered island of Cyprus. So the British asserted sovereignty over Cyprus for the first time. So what that means from the standpoint of today is that on the 5th of November 2014, British sovereignty in the two sovereign base areas effectively celebrated their 100th birthday. Or, to put it another way, depending on your point of view, the British claim to sovereignty in the two sovereign base areas celebrated their 100th birthday last autumn. Now, what did the Turks do in response to the British declaration of war on Turkey on the 5th of November 1914? Turkey used or misused its religion, Islam, for naked political, military, and other connected purposes. I'm going to quote here from a very recent article written by David Motterdell, who's a Cambridge historian. The article was published in History Today, and it focuses on the jihad that was declared by the Turks in response to the British declaration of war on Turkey. This is what Motterdell writes. On Wednesday, the 11th of November 1914, as the Ottoman generals mobilized their troops to fight on the side of the Central Powers, that is to say Austria, Hungary, and Germany, the highest religious authority of the Caliphate in Constantinople issued 5 fatwas, religious decrees, calling Muslims across the world to engage in jihad against the Entente powers, that is to say France, Russia, and the United Kingdom. He also promised them the status of martyr if they fell in the battle. 3 days later, in the name of the Sultan, the commander of the faithful, the decree was read out to a large crowd outside Constantinople's Fatih Mosque. Afterwards, in an officially organized rally, masses with flags and banners moved through the streets of the Ottoman capital, calling for holy war. Across the Ottoman Empire, imams carried the message of jihad to believers in their Friday sermons. To quote from one of these fatwas, the waging of the jihad was, quote, a sacred duty for every Muslim. However, as Motterdell explains in his article, the jihad was selective because it was not aimed at the Christians of Austria, Hungary, or Germany, because, of course, Turkey was sided with Austria, Hungary, and Germany. So it was against this unsettling background that the Second World War unfolded as 1914 came to an end and 1915 began. Jihad had been declared by Turkey. What happened next? I'm summarizing here, but what happened next was that Turkey engaged in the latest installment of its persecution and victimization of the Ottoman citizens, or subjects rather, who were Armenian. Now, I've just mentioned, can I just pause here? A few moments ago I mentioned what occurred in Paris. We saw in Paris an assault on a magazine and the cartoonists and writers and editors who worked in that magazine. Well, on the 23rd of April 1915, the Ottoman genocide of the Armenians effectively began with the arrest of 235 or so prominent Armenian personalities, including a number who spent their lives speaking or writing for a living. The 235 who were arrested included clergymen, lawyers, teachers, editors, journalists and other writers. They had allegedly broken Ottoman law by, allegedly, it said, plotting against the Ottoman government. And in the absence of any fair trial, most, if not all, were summarily executed. The slaughter of the Armenian intellectuals on the 23rd of April set in motion a lamentable chain of events, resulting in the proclamation by Ottoman Turkey of an executive-made decree, the displacement law of the 27th of May 1915. This decree paved the way towards the commission of even more massacres and even more killings. You see, the Ottoman Empire, let's remember, was not a democracy, so legislation was not made by any parliament. It was effectively made by the Sultan, acting as both an executive and as a parliamentarian. And one only needs to read Aristotle's books or the books of Montesquieu to realize that if there is a merging of the executive and the judicial and the legislative branches of government, tyranny ensues. And what Turkey is going to spend the rest of this year denying that they had engaged in these barbaric practices against the Armenians. But what Turkey cannot escape is the fact that the Ottoman Empire was a tyranny where power was vested in one person to such an extraordinary extent. So the Armenian genocide unfolded in the spring and summer of 1915. And by the 28th of July 1915, the persecution of the Armenians had become so barbaric and so prevalent that a British minister appeared in the House of Lords to inform Parliament that, quote, wholesale massacre and wholesale deportation have been carried out under the guise of enforced evacuation of particular villages, and there have been a series of other outrages. The British minister also added that Germany was complicit in what had happened to the Armenians as 1915 unfolded. Now, I'm not going to go into the debate, if we call it a debate, over whether or not Turkey had engaged in genocide. Partly because if I do engage in that debate, I'll upset the president of Turkey, Mr. Erdogan. If you look at the website of the Office of the Prime Minister of Turkey, which Mr. Erdogan held for 11 years, from 2003 to 2014, it includes a rather unsettling warning to anybody who might want to stray into the Armenian question. He says the following, in what's called an unofficial translation into English, but it appears on the website of the Office of Prime Minister. The Republic of Turkey will continue to approach every idea with dignity in line with the universal values of law. Nevertheless, using the events of 1915 as an excuse for hostility against Turkey and turning this issue into a matter of political conflict is inadmissible. Now, I'm not quite sure what Mr. Erdogan means by all of that, but it clearly does form part of a broader backdrop and indeed an integral part of the denialism which has long been maintained by Turkey in the face of that blood-stained and bleak period of history. I'd like to encourage all of you to read the book by Geoffrey Robertson QC, An Inconvenient Genocide, Who Remembers the Armenians? It was published a few weeks ago, and it's not only of enormous interest for those of us who would like to know more about the history and the law relating to what happened to the Armenians, we can also draw lessons and apply them to Cyprus and what's happened in Asia Minor and elsewhere. I'll move on, ladies and gentlemen, to the lessons of history that can be drawn from the three episodes that I've drawn your attention to. So to recap, the German invasion of Belgium on the 4th of August 1914, the British declaration of war on Turkey on the 5th of November 1914, and the jihad that the Ottomans issued in response, and thirdly, the persecution of the Armenian intellectuals, which paved the way to the genocide of the Armenians. So what are the lessons that we can draw? And I think before I explore those lessons of history, I'm conscious of the wise words of another Cambridge historian, Christopher Clark, who's the professor of modern European history there. To quote Professor Clark, history's wisdom comes to us not in the form of pre-packaged lessons, but of oracles whose relevance to our current predicaments has to be puzzled over. He had Delphi in mind, of course. So I'm going to articulate some lessons of history. They're not cast iron lessons that we must follow, but they are lessons like the Delphic oracles that exist for us to study, mull over, and perhaps influence our future behaviour. Let me just first of all show you this magnificent NASA image of the Eastern Mediterranean, which rather makes my point for me. The first lesson to be drawn from the history that I've outlined can be simply stated. The fate of Belgium on the 4th of August 1914 and the German invasion of Belgium on that day serve as a warning that every small sovereign state is inherently vulnerable. It's an obvious point, but as George Orwell once said, it's the first duty of intelligent people to restate the obvious. The vulnerability of a small state is enhanced if it's situated in a dangerous part of the world, as Cyprus is, or in relatively close proximity to a neighbour which is much larger, as well as better armed, ambitious, expansionist, and driven by an aggressive ideology. And if the small state is an island, or part of an island, its vulnerability can be exacerbated by virtue of its inherent insularity and coastline. Now, in such circumstances, what should a small state, such as the Republic of Cyprus, do to protect itself? Well, I would submit that the answer can be found in a simple set of principles which were articulated by Lord Neuberger of Abbotsbury, the President of the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom. In a lecture given on the 10th of October 2014, last year, this is what Lord Neuberger, the President of the Supreme Court of this country, this is what he had to say. It's worth remembering that along with the defence of the realm, the rule of law is one of the two basic and entrenched roles of government. If a government does not provide those two basic features, in other words, defending the country and protecting the rule of law, the government is not worthy of the name. And indeed, without defence of the realm and the rule of law, the value of all the newer services provided by the state, such as welfare, health, and education, will also be undermined. Lord Neuberger added, there is no point in the government providing, for example, flood defences to protect people's houses if those houses are likely to be bombed by enemies, attacked by terrorists, burned down by arsonists, or occupied by unremovable squatters. I would endorse those remarks, if I may, and encourage the government of Cyprus to embrace them. The two primary duties of the government of the Republic of Cyprus are to defend its territory and to protect the rule of law. I now turn to the second of the lessons of history that can be drawn from the preceding analysis. It's already been stated, so I needn't say very much on this, but here it is. Guarantor powers cannot always be relied upon to live up to the solemn promises they have given in treaties or otherwise. I've made that point, I'm not going to dwell on it. The question for Cyprus as the future unfolds is what does it want to do with the Treaty of Guarantee? Cyprus requires a sober national debate about its national security and the various threats which are presented to its territory. So in relation to the Treaty of Guarantee, for example, does Cyprus want to procure the abrogation of the Treaty of Guarantee on the grounds that it has effectively become a dead letter? What the British did after the First World War was they confirmed that the Treaty of London had become a dead letter and had been abrogated as a consequence of the German invasion of Belgium. I'm not saying Cyprus should do this, I'm merely saying it should give serious consideration to it as part of a national debate. Another option might be to give greater emphasis to the guarantee that's been given by the United Kingdom, or not, as the case may be. The United Kingdom has confirmed, and I'm referring here to a parliamentary answer given by the Foreign Office on the 10th of November 2014, the United Kingdom has referred to the unchanging nature of the United Kingdom's commitments under the Treaty of Guarantee. And notice they didn't use the word duties or obligations, they referred to the word commitments. But in view of the discovery of energy resources south of the Republic of Cyprus, and in view of the presence of the sovereign base areas on the southern coast of the island of Cyprus, we have to ask that question. Do we want to rely on the British guarantee? And if so, should the United Kingdom be more closely folded into the national security apparatus of the Republic of Cyprus? And the third dimension to this question, it concerns Israel. There are pros and cons of Cyprus coming closer to Israel. So should Israel be more fully folded into the security apparatus of Cyprus? Now, these are difficult questions, and I'm not going to go into them today. I merely pose them because they are the inevitable consequences of what has gone wrong in Cyprus, and they are also questions that emerge from what happened to Belgium in 1914. The third lesson of history has already been stated, but I will repeat it. The Turks are not averse to betraying the British in the perceived interests of Turkey or Islam, or both. If Turkey betrayed the United Kingdom by growing ever closer to Germany in the years after 1878, there's mounting evidence that Turkey has engaged in another act of treachery by becoming complicit, allegedly, in the emergence, expansion, and endurance of the so-called Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. That, of course, is a jihadist movement which proclaimed a caliphate, so-called caliphate, on the 30th of June 2014. The history of the so-called Islamic State has yet to be written. However, well-connected observers seem to be in little doubt that Turkey has either turned a blind eye to some of the activities of the so-called Islamic State, or Turkey has actively, if covertly, supported it. Others have pointed out that Turkey has been pivotal to the transportation of jihadists from various parts of the European Union to the areas of Syria and Iraq which are under the control of the so-called Islamic State. And we will be, no doubt, seeing a number of court cases through the criminal courts of European Union member states where these allegations will be tested out in open court. It's really troubling what's happening to the east of Cyprus. We saw in London the shock waves that were generated by what occurred round the corner in Paris. There are shock waves generated in Cyprus, I hope, by what's happening in Syria and Iraq, and indeed in Turkey and other parts of the greater Middle East. Let me now turn to the fourth lesson of history, and I'm looking at the clock here. I'll try and finish within my 45-minute deadline. Okay, thank you. The fourth lesson of history, there are 8 in total, don't worry, this isn't a Castro-esque speech that will go on for 500 hours. I only have 8 lessons. The fourth lesson of history is that Turkey has a proven track record of failing to ratify major international treaties. Remember, back in 1914, King George V of the United Kingdom cited the failure of Turkey to ratify one of the Hague Conventions concerning ships. Now, I produced this table, which, if I can find it, I produced a table which hopefully illustrates and dramatizes the point that I'm about to make. Here we are. It's not particularly clear, but hopefully you can just about see it. It's quite interesting. In the immediate post-1945 period, Turkey, by and large, ratified and accepted the terms of major international treaties. So Turkey ratified the United Nations Charter of 1945, the Genocide Convention of 1948, the European Convention of Human Rights of 1950 and the Hague Convention to do with the protection of cultural property in 1954. That was part of the deal, as it were, for Turkey to become a member of NATO, and it was also part of the consequences of Turkey becoming part of the victorious Allies at the end of the Second World War, when Turkey belatedly joined the Allies in 1945, when they realized that the Allies were going to beat Germany. Remember, Turkey had stayed neutral throughout almost all of the Second World War. So there was this sort of very interesting period in the immediate post-1945 period where Turkey did ratify, quite rightly, a number of international treaties. But for some reason, and this may be to do with the Kurdish question, it may be to do with Cyprus, it may be to do with Islamism, Turkey suddenly stopped ratifying international treaties as a matter of course. And here are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Here are 8 straightforward examples of international treaties to do with the most important subjects on the planet, the protection of minorities, the principle of equality, the prohibition against discrimination, and the cause of peace and security on the world stage. And Turkey has not ratified any of these 8. I refer to the Apartheid Convention of 1973, one of the most important of the additional protocols to the Geneva Conventions from 1977, the United Nations Law of the Sea Convention from 1982, the European Charter for Regional or Minority Languages from 1992, the European Framework Convention for the Protection of National Minorities, 1995, the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court of 1998, which deals with war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. The Protocol number 12 to the European Convention on Human Rights to do with the principle of equality before the law, dating to 2000. And one other one, which you can just about see there, the Council of Europe Convention Against Trafficking in Human Beings from 2005. I've discovered that the other day when we found those ships crammed full of people off the coast of Italy. Turkey's not ratified any of those 8. By contrast, Cyprus has ratified 7 of the 8. Greece has ratified 4 of the 8, so there's room for improvement for Greece. And the United Kingdom has ratified 5 of the 7. None of them, incidentally, have ratified the Apartheid Convention for reasons which I'd like to find out. The Annan Plan, of course, as many of us would argue, was contrary to the Genocide Convention and contrary to the Crime of Apartheid Convention. Anyway, that's hopefully made my point for me. And it's something that, if there is to be a settlement of the Cyprus question, needs to be addressed. There's no point Turkey, as they were prepared to do seemingly in 2004, putting their signature to an Annan Plan-style settlement, and I'm dead against any Annan Plan-style settlement. But even if there is an Annan Plan-style settlement in the next year or 2 or 3 or 5 years, there's no point Turkey putting its signature to it if it doesn't ratify all of those treaties and the multiple other treaties that Turkey has hitherto refused to ratify. And that begs the question, which I'm not going to address today, it begs the question as to why Turkey refuses to ratify treaties advancing the cause of equality and prohibiting discrimination on racial, religious, or other grounds. The 5th lesson of history takes me to what occurred in October 1914 when Turkey bombarded the Black Sea ports of Russia. It also takes me to the vessel Barbaros, which is currently somewhere off the coast of either the occupied part of Cyprus or to the south. It seems to change from week to week. Is it to the east at the moment? Now, Turkey is not averse to engaging in provocative military operations beyond its shores or otherwise violating international law. It's a very simple lesson of history. They were supposed to protect their minorities after the 1878 Convention of Defensive Alliance. They ended up butchering the Bulgarians. They were supposed to act as the guarantor power of Cyprus. They ended up invading Cyprus. Today, they're engaging in provocative naval manoeuvres in relation to the exclusive economic zone of Cyprus, whilst at the same time failing to ratify the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which provides a mechanism for dealing with disputes in the sea or in the exclusive economic zone. I mean, my point is either Turkey embraces international law, the instruments of international law, and the dispute resolution mechanisms of international law, or it engages in gunboat diplomacy. And if it engages in gunboat diplomacy, then the West and the United Nations Security Council should take appropriate measures in response. The appeasement of Turkey has been fatal to the West. We're about to see, I'm going to speculate here and depart slightly from my script, we may be seeing over the next few years the catastrophic failure of British policy towards Turkey since the Crimean War. We may very well be seeing the collapse of British policy towards Cyprus since at least 1954, and we could very well be seeing the lessons of history that were articulated in the context of Hitler and the appeasement of Hitler applied with regard to Turkey and what Turkey may or may not be doing in both the Greater Middle East and in Europe. I was rather unsettled to read in two Turkish newspapers this morning, or at least the English translations of the Turkish newspapers, that Mr. Davutoglu, Professor Davutoglu rather, the Prime Minister of Turkey, gave a speech in which he referred to Turkey as the guarantor of the Turkish and Muslim populations of Europe. That was a day or so after a week or so after the horrific events in Paris and a meeting he had with Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany. We know, well, we can speculate as to what that might mean, but I won't go any further. The fifth lesson of history, ladies and gentlemen, we're almost at the end. The sixth lesson of history relates to people like me and the journalists and writers and teachers who are in this room. Scholars, journalists, and other writers are the equivalent of the canaries, the birds that used to be sent down a coal mine to act as an early warning system to alert miners to the release of gas. If writers or canaries fall silent for one reason or another, alarm bells should start ringing. Remember, the genocide of the Armenians began with the arrest and the slaughter of the Armenian writers. The Holocaust effectively began with the burning of the books in Kristallnacht. The lesson of history is that if writers and academics and lawyers are arrested and detained and executed or bombed or shot to death, we should all be deeply, deeply concerned. There's a magnificent judicial observation from a British law lord, Lord Bridge, in the case of Attorney General and Guardian newspapers. This is what Lord Bridge, British law lord, said. Freedom of speech is always the first casualty under a totalitarian regime. Such a regime, a totalitarian regime, cannot afford to allow the free circulation of information and ideas among its citizens. Censorship is the indispensable tool to regulate what the public may and what the public may not know. This should trouble us, ladies and gentlemen. What is happening in Turkey? Well, today apparently they've shut down, a court order in Turkey has prohibited computers in Turkey from displaying that French magazine on the internet in Turkey. But I don't know enough about that. But here are some statistics produced by an organisation called the Committee to Protect Journalists. It's an international organisation, and it's a league table, a global league table, of journalists jailed in 2013, or as of the 1st of December 2013. And you can see that in this global league table, the country which has jailed the most journalists is Turkey. Now, there are 200 or so countries in the world, and that's something that should unsettle us in Cyprus. And that's not an accident of 2013. If you look at the statistics for 2012, Turkey still comes top. It's ahead of Iran, China, Eritrea, Vietnam, Syria, and Azerbaijan, and the others follow. But Turkey, you can see there, is streets ahead of the others in the world in terms of its imprisonment of journalists. I now turn to the seventh lesson of history, which relates to the fate of the Armenian Christians and, of course, more broadly, the fate of the Assyrian Christians and Greek Orthodox Christians who inhabited, or once inhabited, the Ottoman Empire. And the seventh lesson of history, and I'll just put an image from Cyprus while I refer to... Oh, by the way, according to the committee, let me just rewind a second. According to the Committee of Journalists, the Republic of Cyprus has imprisoned no journalists in 2013. Neither has Greece or the United Kingdom. So that's encouraging, and it serves as a counterpoint to what's happened in Turkey. So back to the seventh lesson of history. Oh, sorry, I forgot to show you this as well. Turkey also comes second in the league table of the worst human rights offenders in relation to the European Court of Human Rights, just behind Russia. Just behind Russia. This is in terms of the numbers of judgments in 2013 which found at least one violation of the European Convention. So if I could just close the sixth lesson of history, as it were, Turkey has imprisoned the most journalists of all of the countries in the world, and of all of the 47 member states of the Council of Europe, Turkey comes second as the second worst human rights offender. And this is the guarantor power of Cyprus and the next door neighbour of Cyprus. This is a magnificent photograph, deeply troubling of course, from the British Museum, Crown copyright. It was taken by a British Army official photographer, and it depicts Cypriot refugees queuing for supplies in the Akhna Forest emergency camp that was established in 1974. So here's my seventh lesson of history. It flows from what happened to the Armenians, the Assyrians and the Greeks in 1915 and the years thereafter. The Greater Middle East has been repeatedly scarred by the abuse of power, the misuse of religion, the waging of jihad, the subjection of people to discrimination, the uprooting of people from their homes on the basis of their religion, and other violations of human rights. The region has also borne the brunt of multiple crimes, including the most serious known to international law: war crimes, crimes against humanity, and worst of all, genocide. And that brings me to my final lesson of history. Turkey has a knack of evading justice, notwithstanding the mounting evidence that it has committed war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. Yes, it's been brought before the European Court of Human Rights for human rights violations, but Turkey has not yet, at least, been brought before any international criminal court on the grounds that it has committed the most serious violations known to international law, which include war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. Turkey has got away with it, or, to put it another way, Turkey has been allowed to get away with it. At the end of the First World War, the victorious Allies had a choice, and they could have subjected the political and military leaders of Turkey to an international war crimes tribunal. And some of the victorious Allies indeed thought about this possibility. Or they could have allowed Turkey to press on with its practices. The victorious Allies decided to allow Turkey to press on with its practices. And what occurred to the Greeks in Asia Minor in 1922 was the consequence of that act of appeasement. We then had the pogrom in Istanbul, Constantinople, in 1955. Turkey was allowed to get away with that act of barbarity. What happened 19 years later? Turkey invaded, occupied, ethnically cleansed, and colonized northern Cyprus. What happened next? Turkey was allowed to get away with it. Turkey was appeased. The problem with appeasement is that you don't know what's going to happen next, and you don't know what if I can put it in these terms, what you will, you reap what you sow is the phrase that I'm looking for. You reap what you sow. So what has happened, partly as a consequence of the appeasement of Turkey, we end up, I would suggest, with the so-called Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, to use the name that the American president, the British Prime Minister, and the United Nations all use. They all use the name, the so-called Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. Now, I don't know why, but I suspect one reason is that it serves as a reminder that this organization has its eyes on Israel, and it may indeed have its eyes on Cyprus and other parts of the former Ottoman Empire. And that, by the way, is the official magazine, if that's the correct phrase, of the so-called Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. And that was published, as I understand it, in the summer of 2014. And it's written in English, and it's a very professionally made magazine in the sense that you can see there it looks like the sort of magazine that you would pick up in W.H. Smith's or on the English High Street. Of course, it's not sold on the English High Street, but it's available online, which is nowadays the easiest way for anybody to read jihadist literature. What's the point that I'm coming to? And I'm going to finish with these thoughts. Appeasement is dangerous. Appeasement doesn't work. It gives you a little temporary respite, but it eventually catches up with you. And I regret to say this, but the appeasement of Turkey is now catching up with this country. It's catching up with France, it's catching up with the rest of the European Union, and it may well end up catching the Americans, the Russians, and the Chinese, who also sit in the Security Council as permanent members. Let me just explain to you what I mean. The so-called Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant is situated in substantial parts of Iraq and Syria. It shares a number of extraordinary characteristics with the so-called Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, which is, of course, the subordinate administration of Turkey in the Turkish-occupied north of Cyprus. What are these similarities? I would identify the following, and this should unsettle the West, and it should serve as a warning that the appeasement must stop. First of all, both the so-called, I will refer to it as the TRNC in inverted commas, but that's, of course, in inverted commas. I won't say that all the way through. The so-called TRNC and the so-called Islamic State are situated in areas which used to form part of the Ottoman Empire and the Caliphate that formed part of the Ottoman Empire. So that's the first similarity. Secondly, the so-called TRNC and the so-called Islamic State are the products of what amount to unlawful, purported unilateral declarations of independence, contrary to public international law. Third similarity, both the so-called Islamic State of the Levant and the so-called TRNC remain unrecognized, save by those who set them up. Fourth similarity, both the so-called TRNC and the so-called Islamic State represent an affront to the United Nations Charter and the sovereignty of existing sovereign states. Fifth similarity, both the so-called TRNC and the so-called Islamic State are an affront to the crime of apartheid convention and so many of the other international legal instruments designed to promote equality and non-discrimination, which Turkey has hitherto refused to ratify. The sixth similarity. Both the so-called TRNC and the so-called Islamic State exist as a direct result of gross violations of human rights, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and even genocide. Seventh similarity, both the so-called TRNC and the so-called Islamic State have shown scant regard for the historic buildings, Christian religious sites, artifacts and cultural heritage of the lands under their de facto governance. And both the so-called TRNC and the so-called Islamic State, and I would add Turkey as the occupying power in northern Cyprus, have not respected the faiths adhered to by non-Muslims, nor have they adequately respected their places of worship. And the eighth similarity, there are others, but I'll stick to 8. The eighth similarity is that both the so-called Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus and the so-called Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant have been purportedly established to provide a state, in inverted commas, or homeland, in inverted commas, for Muslims, in circumstances which cannot be reconciled with the rule of law, as distinct from rule by Sharia, and the inclusive principles of pluralist Western liberal democracy, as distinct from the exclusive principles of Islamism. Now, having drawn attention to those 8 similarities between the so-called TRNC and the so-called Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, I remind you that 100 years ago, Turkey declared jihad in November 1914. I also remind you that more recently, Turkey and the leadership of the regime in the occupied northern Cyprus have invoked religion to justify the unlawful state of affairs in the Turkish-occupied part of Cyprus. To illustrate the point, let me just give you 3 examples. In 2012, Dr. Eroglu, the so-called president, in inverted commas, of the so-called TRNC, took it upon himself to describe or redescribe the Turkish Cypriot community of Cyprus as the Muslim Turkish community in northern Cyprus. I mean, there is some coherence to that, because if you look at the definition of a Turkish Cypriot under the Constitution of 1960, which was a consequence of the Zurich-London agreements, a Turkish Cypriot is defined with reference to Islam. But they weren't described as Turkish Cypriots in the 1960 Constitution, at least not expressly, and yet Dr. Eroglu has used that expression. In the same year as that expression was used by Dr. Eroglu, in 2012, Professor Davutoglu, the then Foreign Minister of Turkey, who's now the Prime Minister of Turkey, referred to Muslim Turkish Cypriots. He said so in a statement published on the 28th of September 2012 at the Organization of Islamic Cooperation Ministerial Annual Coordination. More recently, when he visited the Turkish-occupied north of Cyprus in August 2014, by which time I think he had become president, Mr. Erdogan reportedly declared, and I'm quoting here from a report of his meeting with the journalists in the occupied north, "Northern Cyprus is Muslim. We shouldn't hesitate to be proud of this and make it more prevalent. We should also be more interested in increased religious education and mosques." Now, I've got to be careful with what I say now, but I'm going to just leave you with a couple of thoughts. I'm going to refer to this in a lecture that I'm going to give in Cyprus next week, so I don't want to steal my own thunder, as it were. But the proposed settlement of the Cyprus question is predicated on the notion of bicommunalism and bizonalism. Bicommunalism is, in effect, a product of Islamic, or rather Islamist, ideology, the idea that people are carved up into 2 sides, the idea that people belong to 2 separate religious communities. It should have no place in the West, certainly not in the European Union. And if bicommunalism is allowed to be revived within the framework of a Cyprus settlement, will Islamists seize on the bicommunalism in one part of the European Union and try to apply bicommunalism in France, or the Netherlands, or Sweden, or the United Kingdom? Bicommunalism is the reverse of Western liberal democracy, and the pluralist principles of equality and bicommunalism should be cast into the waste bin of history. And bisonality is just an extension of bicommunalism. It's segregation by another name. That should have no place in the European Union today. And I would take this opportunity to invite Cyprus and all three of its guarantor powers to ratify the crime of apartheid convention of 1973. The negotiations, I would suggest, should come to an end, and we should not accept their legitimacy, their moral legitimacy, unless and until all four of the guarantor powers ratify the crime of apartheid convention of 1973. Because what they're trying to do in Nicosia, in that so-called peace process, is effectively introduce a form of apartheid together with a form of Islamism. I'm going to conclude, ladies and gentlemen. I've hopefully drawn your attention to the enduring importance of the First World War and the opening months of the First World War. I've hopefully highlighted the perils of appeasement and the extraordinary dangers facing not just Cyprus, but the whole of the European Union, and indeed every country on the planet that adheres to the principles of Western liberal democracy. And I would like to end by adapting a question posed by Thucydides. The question is this. I'm just going to change Athens for Cyprus here. The question is this. When will there be justice in Cyprus? Well, if we follow the advice of Thucydides, the answer is straightforward. There will be justice in Cyprus when those who are not injured are as outraged as those who are. As the Western states nurse the wounds inflicted upon the West by those waging jihad and by those who sponsor or otherwise support jihadists, perhaps the time has come for Western powers to do their utmost to save Cyprus in order to save themselves. Thank you.